All right, what we saw there was Craig Cobb, who has a very extreme notion of race as biology and fancies himself as a white supremacist. And then he comes to find out that about 14% of his DNA, which is between 1/6 and 1/7 of his DNA, is of African ancestry. And given how he conceives of race, this is a problem for him, and he has to claim like, oh, it's just statistical noise, which it really isn't, or has to somehow kind of walk around this fact. And it's interesting because he does make that claim that oil and water don't mix, that the races can't mix because they're so different, but he's actually a living testament to the fact that they can. So he too, in a very extreme form, overlooks how similar we all are and how much DNA we do share between each other. All right, a second problem we see is that most of the differences we do see between individuals are literally skin deep, in that, yes, different people can have different shades of skin color, but when it comes down to the inside, our biology, our physiology, a lot of that is the same. And we can see an example here where two people from the same high school who barely knew each other, right? One needed a kidney transplant, and the other person was able to donate to him. Even though they're of different races or appear to be of different races, one person was able to donate his kidney to the other person, and there weren't any issues. An interesting historical fact is that when blood donations started becoming feasible and popular, the Red Cross was set up so that it would segregate blood supplies. So if you're a white person, you'd only get blood from white individuals. If you're black, you'd only get blood from black individuals. And they did this, so they segregated blood, even though they knew that there was no biological or physiological reason why a white person couldn't receive a transfusion from a person who was black, and vice versa. Just indicating that we are similar. We're so similar that we can donate blood and organs to other people of different races, and it doesn't cause a problem. Now, my understanding is there might be a handful of exceptions to this. There might be cases where you do need people that are genetically similar to you, or there are certain conditions that are really prevalent in a specific population. But the amount of those things where kind of like your race would matter in terms of physiological things, those are much more the exception than the rule. All right, so yes, maybe there's a handful of exceptions, but for the most part, these kind of things don't really matter. The differences are just skin deep. All right, another and very important idea is that the differences we see between people are actually good. Good in the sense that they are a sign that someone's ancestors adapted to a particular environment or to a particular climate. So, to the extent that we see racial differences, we should be inspired or in awe of the fact that through evolution, humans were able to adapt to these different climates. But the traditional understanding of race doesn't align with what really is the true implication. If you want to run with this idea of race as biology, then the differences you see between different racial groups, you should think like, man, that's wonderful, that's good. These changes allowed certain people to survive in certain climates, and that's a wonderful thing. But our traditional conceptions of race do tend to see them differently. So here, right, we can see differences in skin color between two populations. This is someone who's representing Sweden. It has kind of the quintessential Swedish look, blonde hair, fair skin. Down here is the Prime Minister of Kenya, right? We see darker complexion. And what we should see here when we do see differences in skin tone and things like that, what we should see is, wow, That's really amazing that your ancestors were able to develop lighter skin and lighter hair so you can absorb vitamin D better in colder climates through the sun. That's wonderful. And down here, we should see that's really wonderful that your ancestors were able to develop darker skin to provide you more protection from the intense sunlight. That's all we should read into these racial conceptions, but we don't, or at least the traditional conception of race doesn't see things in these terms. And as the fish reading pointed out, some of the physiological things that we try to tie to race are actually quite arbitrary, and there's other things that we could focus on that we didn't. One of which is body size. One example of a population that tends to be very tall and thin are the Maasai. And they are tall and thin, likely, if we believe in the idea of evolution, because this is a body type that's well suited to expel heat. And if you're living in a very hot climate, it can be an advantage then to have a body shape that does expel heat. This is the easiest way to keep you cool, or physiological way to keep you cool. In contrast, people who are Inuit, right, who live in extremely cold climates, their physiology tends to be shorter and rounder. And you want to, in a cold climate, you want to be round because that's the best way to keep heat and to retain heat. So it's a survival function, right, or a sign of adaptation to a particular climate, right? Different appearances, different climates. In both cases, these persons' ancestors had adopted, and those differences we see are actually good things. You may or may not know this, but if you know that people in Polynesia, in Pacific Islands, tend to be very big people, large in stature. And the understanding for why that is the case is that in order for people to settle these islands that were distant from traditional land masses, so really go out far into the ocean, the people who were most likely to survive those long distances at sea, when food resources and water could be quite scarce, were probably larger people because they had greater stores of energy, that they could use if they didn't receive food for a long time. So someone who's really skinny, right, if they're trapped out in the ocean for a week or two without access to food or not much access to food, they're much more likely to expire from that situation than someone who has more mass and then can use its internal reserves of energy to keep someone going. So again, this is another effect of a population adapting to a particular environment. Here, those long boat rides and travel times out to these distant islands.